My talk is titled Environmental Injustice in the Heart of the Great Lakes. And first I want to introduce some basic terms that you might not be familiar with. I'm a cultural anthropologist by training, and I have mostly focused on indigenous peoples, particularly in North America. But about 5 or 6 years ago, I took a turn into environmental anthropology, which is a different sort of a subfield. And environmental anthropology, whereas cultural anthropology generally is the study of living contemporary communities and all of their complexities in the context of larger social, economic, and political structural forces. Whereas environmental anthropology is more of a focus on the topic of anthropology concerned with various aspects of human interactions with the environment, which is very broad. You can probably think of a number of different ways that humans interact with the environment, different sorts of approaches and angles on that. And as I got more into environmental anthropology, as I continued with my own research that had originally propelled me into that field, I came to realize that what I actually was focusing on was environmental justice issues. That's a particular topic that even is not necessarily within anthropology. Environmental justice can be pursued by sociologists, by people in politics, and any number of different fields. But I approach it as a cultural anthropologist. So, environmental justice can be defined in a number of different ways. I think you've run across some definitions in your reading. I'm going to define it as the recognition of the fact that unsustainable practices, such as large-scale resource extraction, industrial pollution, and urban growth, do not affect everyone equally. Rather, some people disproportionately bear the burdens. They are removed from their land near oil drilling or coal mining sites. They have toxic landfills and polluting industrial facilities located in their communities. They experience loss of property value and quality of life due to their proximity to these kinds of operations. And they suffer serious health consequences resulting from living near and working in these areas. At the same time, other people disproportionately benefit from such operations, mainly in the form of high-paying jobs that would be in the upper management, corporate profits, and dividends to shareholders. Most of us are somewhere in between those two extremes with regard to these issues. So what I want to emphasize is sustainability. Actually, I don't want to put that up there quite yet. I want to say that as someone interested primarily in environmental justice issues, I do recognize the profound truth that when unsustainable practices make life on Earth difficult or even impossible, every person on the planet will suffer. And in that sense, here's where we get the saying, a simple way of putting that is, we're all in it together. When it comes to environmental issues, sustainability issues, keeping a viable and sustainable planet, we're all in it together. We just have the one planet Earth. But as someone who focuses on environmental justice issues in my own work, I want to emphasize on those that bear the brunt of unsustainable development much sooner and to a much greater degree than others. And in that sense, I think about environmental justice as being an environmental justice approach recognizes that some are more in it than others, with the it being the pollution, the health issues, the losses, the harms that I just discussed. So while I completely recognize the first one, we really are all in it together in a very real way, I want to focus on the disparities, the ways in which some are more in it than others. So that's sort of the orientation that I'm taking, kind of where I'm coming from with regard to these issues. And now I want to talk about the location that I'll be looking at. And that is the St. Clair River within the Great Lakes of North America. So, some orientation. There's the upper part of North America, US and Canada. I'm sure you recognize that. And as we zero in on the Great Lakes region, I want to point out to people who are watching in Nigeria or perhaps other parts of the world that Earlham College is located right here in Indiana, like by the Ohio border. So we're not quite literally in the Great Lakes region, but we're pretty close to it. So the Great Lakes of North America are shared by the United States and Canada, and together they comprise the largest freshwater source in the world. And yet, this precious water resource is becoming increasingly compromised by pollution. This pollution is most severe in watersheds along the lakes that are in the industrialized areas. And in 1987, 43 such sites were designated as areas of concern by both the U.S. and Canadian governments. The term area of concern means that the local water is seriously compromised by pollution in those areas. So here's a map of the areas of concern in the Great Lakes Basin. And what we're going to be looking at is right along here. You probably know this, but I'll just mention that the water flows, east from here. So it goes on out through the St. Lawrence Seaway up to the Atlantic Ocean over here. So as the water passes through this, where we're going to be focusing, there's very, very heavy industry there that we're going to be learning about. And that's the St. Clair Channel. So a close-up from Google Earth of the St. Clair Channel shows the St. Clair River between the city of Sarnia there at the top, just as Lake Huron empties into the river there, the city of Sarnia, and then it goes down to Lake St. Clair, which I want to point out is heart-shaped, and then it goes on down the Detroit River and on out into Lake Erie. And because of that heart shape of Lake St. Clair, this channel, this part of the Great Lakes, is sometimes referred to as the heart of the Great Lakes, and hence the title of my talk. But it is also worth noting that the St. Clair Channel is also the most polluted section of the entire Great Lakes region. So I am going to be focusing in this talk on water and its uses, its meanings, and the political economic power to control or change the conditions. So in discussing the ways in which this important waterway has been conceptualized and utilized, I'm going to discuss two different constituencies along the banks of the St. Clair River: the Chippewa Reservation and the industrial area nicknamed Canada's Chemical Valley, along with local executives to those corporations. And I just want to say to you all, if you were here for Rod Plain's talk in this class a couple of weeks ago, you have a sort of a preview, and in some ways, some things I'm going to be saying will overlap with some things Ron said, but this will also give you, I hope, a larger context and some other information beyond that. So I argue that the corporations whose plants comprise the so-called Chemical Valley have by far the most power in the region, and therefore their concept of the river's purpose has prevailed over the meanings that the river has had for the Chippewa people. Furthermore, those who benefit most from the operations of the industrial facilities are also those that are least affected by the pollutions that these facilities emit. So I'll be talking about the uses and meanings of water for each of these two groups, and then considering the differential power between the small community on the one hand and the multinational petrochemical corporations and their management personnel on the other. So we'll start with a place called Aamjiwnaad. I've been using the term Chippewa, and I've used that term because it's probably one that most people have heard as the name of a native group in North America. Another term for the same people is Ojibwe. But from now on, I will use the native language term for these people, which is Anishinaabe. Then the name of the particular place, the particular reserve where this group of Anishinaabe live is Aamjiwnaad. So to give you a little background on traditional Anishinaabe people in the Upper Great Lakes region. They have always been a water-going people. Birch bark canoes are very strongly, they sort of invented this style of birch bark canoe and used these canoes for transportation throughout the river systems of the Great Lakes area and even in the Great Lakes themselves. During summers, large groups of Anishinaabe people would gather in fishing camps. And one such location is for this type of a large fishing village was where the water body that is now known as Lake Huron emptied into the river that is now known as the St. Clair River. This depicts the spearfishing that Anishinaabe people are noted for, and you'll see this is a photograph. It's historical, it's more recent, probably in the early 1900s. This type of spearfishing is still practiced in some places throughout the larger sort of Anishinaabe territory. So, Anishinaabe people traditionally have thought of water as a source of sustenance, means of transportation, cleanliness, and home to numerous important spiritual beings, both benevolent and malevolent. So this is how, these are more general kinds of beliefs and practices with regard to water, but also what I want to focus on is specifically with regard to Aamjiwnaang, that particular community in that particular location. This is how a tribal member, a tribal historian, in a 2007 book describes the significance of the local water right there where the Huron empties into the St. Clair River. His name is David Plain, and yes, he is a relative of Ron Plain. There are many, many people at Aamjiwnaang named Plain. David Plain writes, when we first located there were great rapids at the mouth of the river. Below the rapids, the river grew very deep with a strong current. Along the banks, there were back currents flowing toward the lake, flowing north toward the lake. It was said that if one looked closely, one could catch glimpses of the Minida, or spirits, just beneath the surface. This is the meaning of the name Aamjiwnaang. And I think it's worth pointing out, I said that according to traditional Anishinaabe beliefs, the water was home to both good and evil spirits, and in this case, these are helping benevolent kinds of spirits that dwell in water, or at least that used to dwell in water. But over time, the people of Aamjiwnaang lost land and water access. By the early 1800s, white settlers were moving into southwestern Ontario, as well as into the territory that was to become Michigan on the other side of the border. The resulting pressure for farmland resulted in Anishinaabe people on both sides of the border being subjected to treaties in which they were forced to give up huge tracts of land in exchange for being allowed to continue to live in the region, but confined to small reserves. This entailed, that's what happened to Aamjiwnaang. They were first restricted, the Anishinaabe people of the area were first restricted to 10,027 acres, which is really, really small compared to what they used to have. And then that further has been chipped away at over the years to the point that it is now only 2,027 acres. This entailed drastic changes in their entire way of life, and including their relationship to water. They did retain one piece of their land that's right along the St. Clair River, but for the most part, they lost the shoreline that goes along the St. Clair River. At the same time, industry was growing, and these two phenomena were not unrelated. So here you can see again, using Google Earth, the white, as the white gets really intense along there, that's very, I'll show you some photographs later on about what it looks like on the ground. But from the aerial view, it's the like more intense of the white color. That means the more intense the industrial buildup. And it's the writing sort of obscures it down here, but that intense industrial buildup also goes along to the southern border. And there are a few facilities around here. So the green is Amchenang. That's the one, you know, that what's left of Amchenang is the one place that they didn't, they haven't been able to build their facilities on. So just very, very brief sweeping history of the buildup of industry there. Actually, this is oil country, not so much anymore. Actually, not at all anymore. It's pretty well dried up. But this was a source of oil in the early 1800s, and they started really drilling for it in the mid-1800s. And then a refinery was established in Sarnia in the early 1900s. And then the petrochemical company, petrochemical corporations, which are the ones that take the oil and make like plastics and all kinds of synthetic products and things like that that are petroleum-based. That began in the early 1940s when a synthetic rubber plant called Polymer, located in Sarnia, and it was all about the war effort. It was World War II, and the traditional sources of rubber, like from rubber trees, natural rubber, were cut off because of the war. So they made synthetic rubber for the war, and that was sort of the beginning of what we now call Chemical Valley, as opposed to the earlier oil economy. So it really grew strongly between the 1950s and up through the 1980s, was more and more locating into this area. Each one sort of seemed to bring others after it. The buildup has stopped now. They are no longer, it's very rare now for a new facility to locate there, but they maintain a very strong hold on the area. So this aerial view shows what it looks like from space. But then let's go down to the ground level now and see what it looks like for people who are there. This is when you first enter Chemical Valley. You'll see something like that as you go driving through it. And really, I mean, a picture is worth 1,000 words, but these photographs cannot, you were there. Yeah. Rachel was on a field trip, I think, with an earlier class, and would you not agree that even as sort of horrific as these photos are, that it really warrants the scale. And I think one of the things, first of all, you can't smell or hear from the photographs, and those are other senses that are affected by the industry. But the other thing is just the sheer scope of it, because you probably remember, I mean, you just drive and drive and drive and drive for miles or kilometers, since we're in Canada, and it just keeps going and keeps going and keeps going. It's really quite astounding and kind of horrifying for those who aren't used to it. So that's Chemical Valley. This is a bit further south out of the very strong concentration, but it's also part of Chemical Valley. This happens to be a Shell docking facility. And this is just one example of how the river is used. The industry does go inland, and a lot of the facilities are located away from the river, but the location of the river is very important for the use to which it is put. You can see this giant freighter, and these go through the area all the time. This is to take the products, the plastics, substances, and things like that, sort of out to market. They also bring raw materials down from the further north and west, although for the petrochemical industry, most of the raw material comes through the pipelines from the tar sands these days. So, so this is an example of the use of the river. And there have been, the other thing is that they discharge their wastes into the river, which they're really not supposed to do, but it happens a lot. So there have been literally thousands of spills into the river of toxic substances. And these are only the ones that are reported by the offending facilities or discovered in subsequent investigations. So we can only imagine how many more spills there are that never are actually detected. But by far the most infamous discovery with regard to spills was the blob, the Sarnia blob of 1985. And I don't have a picture because it can't be depicted because it wasn't visible. If I were to give a picture, it would just be the nice, beautiful blue St. Clair River. It was all down below, and that's why it took it a long time. It took people a long time to discover it. So in 1985, a huge underwater slit was discovered near the bottom of the St. Clair River, just south of Sarnia. And it was dubbed the blob by the media. It contained approximately 11,000 liters of the highly toxic chemical compound polychloroethylene, PCE, mixed with various other hazardous substances such as lead, mercury, and arsenic. Dow Chemical was found to be responsible for the blob and eventually took responsibility for a cleanup operation. But with so many heavily polluting facilities concentrated into a small area, most spills and leaks into the St. Clair River could not and still cannot be traced to a single source. These problems continue to the present, and in fact, August through October of this very year, 2013, set a record for the number of incidents reported. So it's not getting better. So just to sum up, the meanings or uses of water by the petrochemical industry are transportation of products. I didn't mention this, but also a coolant for processing. A lot of the operations they're doing require a lot of heat, and they have to run water through in order to cool it down and then discharge it back into the river. And most troubling, most disturbing is that the water is a medium into which to deposit their toxic wastes. So this presents a dramatic contrast to the values placed on the St. Clair River by traditional Anishinaabe people, as well as the values of contemporary residents of Aamjiwnaang. So let's return to the Aamjiwnaang Reserve and consider the effects of this industry's use of water on the people of Aamjiwnaang. Aamjiwnaang residents are surrounded daily. Those photographs that I showed you before, those are right on the border of the reserve. They're surrounded by obvious and oppressive presence of heavily polluting petrochemical plants. Here's where their daycare was located up until a few years ago when they realized that they had to move because all the kids were suffering respiratory problems. Here's where the kids play. And this is, I told you, and also you saw on Google Earth, there's one piece of the reserve that does go all the way to the St. Clair River. So the reserve is able to retain that waterfront area. It's pretty small. Residents of the reserve really like to fish there, not only because it's relaxing and a source of extra food like it would be for a lot of people, but there's also a deep cultural significance to fishing that remains important to community members. So they want to fish there, and they sometimes do fish there, but it's just enough downstream from some of those heavily polluting facilities that fish really are contaminated and should not be consumed. And then there are the health problems. You can imagine probably just from what you've seen and heard so far. There's constant proximity to pollutants in water, air, and soil of their homeland has taken a toll, not only on cultural practices and social well-being of the community, but also on their health. Cancers are commonplace in people of all ages. Many adults suffer from respiratory diseases of various kinds. I mentioned the childhood asthma that was so prominent in the daycare center, but it pretty much goes throughout the children of the community. And then, in a way, almost most alarming was a dramatically skewed birth ratio that was a study revealed in 2005 that over a 10-year period, there came to be, the birth ratio is supposed to be about 50-50. boys slightly edging out over girls. That's the normal biological, it's just a fact around the world. But at Amjanong, it was found that during particularly a certain 5-year period, it sort of became more and more skewed, and then during this 5-year period, there were, for every 2 girls born, only 1 boy. That's a super skewed ratio and requires explanation. This received attention from around the world, from scientists coming there and wanting to learn about it, because this is a very rare phenomenon in human populations, and it has been found in animal studies to correlate strongly with the particular kinds of toxins that are being emitted from plants in Chemical Valley. So it's reasonable. Correlation is not causation, but it's reasonable to at least investigate what's going on here. It's very troubling. So, this isn't a very good quality picture. It's kind of fuzzy and you probably can't see it. But I will simply mention, this is just a random snapshot of kids on the playground at Amjanong. There's about 8 kids here and only 1 or 2 of them are boys. So it's just sort of it wasn't posed or anything like that, but it's just sort of, this is the reality at Amjanong with regard to boys versus girls. Okay, so specifically, back to the topic of environmental injustice. One way of illustrating the disparities between the 2 groups this case focuses on is to consider 2 views from the Blue Water Bridge that connects Michigan to Ontario across the St. Clair River. So you go, if you're coming through Michigan, as I always do when I drive up there, and you go up what's called the Thumb area of Michigan, the Thumb region, and you go up to the city of Fort Huron. That's where you cross over into Sarnia, Ontario. And as you're crossing the bridge, if you look to the south, you see this. That's where Amjanong is, back behind all of that, and surrounded by it. If you look to the north, as you're crossing the Blue Water Bridge, you see this. And it really is that dramatic of contrast. This is where Amjanong is located. This is where the people that are benefiting the most from industry, the executives and higher kind of management employees and their families live. This is a creek that runs through the reserve. This is where Amjanong children played for generations, but it's now condemned due to excessive amounts of mercury and other toxic substances dumped into it over the years. This is a view from the deck of a house to the north of Sarnia. This private beach is where children of Chemical Valley executives can play and swim. Amjanong residents and others who live in Chemical Valley are clearly not in it together with the Chemical Valley executives and their families. This is not to demonize. I really want to make this clear. There's nothing wrong. I mean, more power to, that's nice. I'm glad that the kids get to play there. I'm not criticizing the individuals, and I certainly don't want to demonize them. But I do want to show that they are differently positioned, very dramatically differently positioned with regard to their relationship to the industry and the externalities of the heavy industry that is located there. Now, there are people fighting back, and again, those in this class who were here for Ron Plain's talk, he did say a bit about this this lawsuit that is being mounted here. 2 activists have initiated a lawsuit claiming that their charter rights to life, health, and security of person are being violated by the Ministry of Environment in giving Chemical Valley Industries license to pollute. The other defendant is the Suncor Corporation, which has a plant that sits right next to the Amjanong Cemetery and has violated many of the anti-pollution laws that are in place. The plaintiffs, Ron Plain and Ada Lockridge, are being represented by the non-profit environmental group Eco-Justice of Canada. The lawsuit has already been delayed for over 2 years by legal maneuvers, but Ron and Ada are in it for the long haul, and this case will eventually come to trial. most likely within the next year or so. If they prevail, this case could have major implications for Canadian policy and law. So we've looked at different meanings of water. Now we can consider these meanings and uses and how they are not created equal. Rather, one constituency, the corporations that own and operate Chemical Valley facilities and those who manage them, get to pursue their preferred use of the St. Clair River and related waterways to transport their products, cool their processing operations, and serve as a medium for their waste disposal. In contrast, Aamjiwnaang residents and others downstream from Chemical Valley are increasingly unable to use water in ways that are meaningful to them. And at the same time, they must bear the brunt of damage caused by industrial uses of water. Okay, so this is where I want to talk about, in concluding, I want to stress that the ways in which industrial uses and abuses of water, the ways in which industry uses and abuses water in communities in Canada's Chemical Valley is not unusual. Literally, these same multinational corporations and others like them are operating in locations around the world. One that is especially relevant to students at the American University in Nigeria is, of course, Shell. I encourage each of you, wherever you're from, wherever you now live, to consider how issues of environmental justice play out in your area, especially with regard to water. Those in different locations will have different examples of environmental injustice and the communities it affects. Place is not particularly important to corporations, other than finding material resources such as water and finding places where they can have lax oversight so they can pursue their operations with minimal interference. It is local communities, families, villages, towns, ethnic groups that bring their own deep meanings to local bodies of water. And it is these meanings and the life-sustaining practices they inspire that make each case of environmental injustice unique. And it is also local communities that eventually become angry enough or desperate enough to fight back against corporations and their practices. I just mentioned the inspiring case of two Aamjiwnaang members bringing a lawsuit to gain justice ultimately for all Canadians. But there's also more grassroots initiatives that are beginning to spring up, and this strikes me as a very hopeful sign. Non-Native people on both sides of the U.S.-Canada border are joining with Aamjiwnaang activists to bring public awareness to the issues. These efforts and others like them in locations around the world might well ultimately bring real change and achieve for themselves and others at least some member of environmental justice. Thank you.